So, just like the Halloween update where the Slasher got a huge buff, this winter update brought a Sledger rework as well. And let me tell you, it needed it. Because when the Sledger first came out, it was a very good tower that could freeze enemies and deal massive damage to enemies, and it could basically freeze any enemy in the game for 2 seconds, except for major bosses. Until of winter 2023, when TDS reworked the ice mechanics, Sledger was underperforming as its freezing mechanic was still tied to the old one, and since it came out in 2021 with little to no changes, it was starting to fall off and kind of became a bad tower. Until now, when they announced a rework for this tower and testing out, it's really good now. Even though it still doesn't instantly freeze, it makes up for it with its damage, which is heavily increased, but we'll talk about that when we get into the stats. But one more thing I want to say is that you can now see where the Sledger is aiming, which is a nice addition to the tower. But with that, let's talk about the stats. So for the first few levels, it's nothing special. It can't freeze anything from level 0 to 2, but it can slow down enemies and makes up for it in its damage, which on level 0 it's 8, level 1 is 12, and level 2 is 25, which is great for the early game, as it can basically deal with all those kinds of enemies. And before we continue, just to let you know, the fire rate doesn't change at all in any of its levels. Now on level 3, it can do 45 damage, and it starts freezing enemies. And depending on the size, it either takes a few hits or it's instant. And it only has a slight range increase, but it can now hit 4 enemies. And this is the level you want to get a lot off, as it's still pretty cheap, and it can do a lot of damage, and it can still freeze a lot of enemies too. But now we get to the more expensive, but much better levels, where they start doing some real damage. On level 4, it does 75 damage, and when it hits a frozen enemy, it does double damage, which is 150 damage. And it can hit 4 enemies at a time, so it technically can do 100 damage. And if all 6 Sledgers hit 1 frozen enemy at the same time, it would be a combined damage of 900 to a single enemy. Do you see how crazy this rework is? Sledger is now one of the best, or not one of the best, is the best stun tower in the game again. Better than the Warden, better than the Electroshocker, all of them, in my opinion, of course. And it's only level 4. Oh, and it can also slow down enemies by 65% for 3 seconds. So I think it's pretty overpowered. But now we get to level 5. And while it's pretty expensive, it's really good. So for starters, the damage is 140 per swing, so it can already do a lot of damage. And if it hits a frozen enemy, it does 280 damage, while now being able to hit 6 enemies. So one tower can do the damage of 6 towers hitting 1 enemy. And there's a new Aftershock, which does an extra 28 damage to enemies behind it, and if all 6 stack, then it's 168 damage to multiple enemies, which is crazy. Oh, and it also freezes for 1.5 seconds, and it can slow down enemies by 80% for 3 seconds. Also, I neglected to mention the DPS because it doesn't show its full strength, and this is from the wiki, DPS only assumes 1 enemy is hit and is not frozen. So the DPS does not show its true damage output, and that's what this review is trying to show you. And here are the DPS numbers if you're interested. Now, what's my opinion on this tower after testing it out? It's great. I said it once and I'll say it again. It is the best support tower in the game, as it can do a ton of damage and freeze enemies for almost 2 seconds, which doesn't sound like a lot, but for a tower defense game, it's basically forever, cause giving towers extra time to fire at an enemy is great. And I also forgot to mention, but its freezing is also insane, because not only does it help it deal massive amounts of damage and also slows down enemies, it can also basically freeze any enemy in the game. If an enemy doesn't have a no freeze modifier or is not labeled as a boss, it will freeze. No matter how big the enemy is, it will freeze. But the bigger it is, the less time it will be frozen. But even delaying larger enemies, even if it's just by a little bit, is still amazing because it's already moving slow, and slowing it down even more makes it much easier to kill. But with that, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, subscribe, comment down below your opinions on the new Sledger, and I will see you in another one. Bye! Also, there's one more thing I left out. Choo-choo!